Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today, we drift into the fascinating world of medieval castles and uncover the secrets of how they defended against relentless invaders. From towering walls to deadly traps, we'll explore the ingenuity, strategy, and sheer determination that shaped these incredible fortresses. If you enjoy diving deep into history, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more immersive journeys into the past. Let's step back in time and experience the power of medieval defense like never before. Imagine a world where the horizon itself feels dangerous, where every distant dust cloud might signal an approaching army, and where peace is not a condition but a brief pause between conflicts. This was the medieval world, a time when borders were fragile, loyalties shifted like sand, and survival depended not on laws or diplomacy, but on strength. In such a world, castles were not luxuries or romantic backdrops for legends. They were necessities. They were the difference between safety and slaughter, between rule and ruin. Medieval life was shaped by the constant threat of violence. Kingdoms were fractured into rival territories ruled by kings, dukes, lords, and warlords, each competing for land, resources, and power. Armies could appear with little warning, and when they did, villages burned, crops were destroyed, and civilians were caught in the chaos. There were no standing national armies as we understand them today. Defense was local, personal, and immediate. If a lord could not protect his people, he would soon lose both land and authority. In this harsh reality, the castle emerged as the ultimate solution to a timeless problem. How do you defend people, power, and resources against an enemy determined to take them by force? The answer was stone, height, and fear. The earliest castles were simple wooden fortifications, hastily constructed on hills or mounds of earth. These early strongholds revealed an essential truth of warfare: elevation mattered. From higher ground, defenders could see farther, strike harder, and react sooner. Over time, wood gave way to stone, and temporary defenses evolved into permanent fortresses. Each generation of conflict refined castle design, turning them into increasingly sophisticated machines of war. A medieval castle was not a single structure, but a complex system. It was a carefully planned environment where every wall, stairway, and doorway served a defensive purpose. Nothing was accidental. Narrow passages forced attackers into tight formations. Steep staircases were designed so defenders could strike more easily with their right hands, while invaders struggled to swing their weapons. Even the layout of rooms reflected military thinking, ensuring that if one section fell, others could still hold. To the people of the Middle Ages, castles represented stability in a violent world. When the alarm bells rang and smoke rose in the distance, villagers abandoned their homes and fled toward the looming stone walls. Inside the castle, they found not comfort, but survival. The courtyard filled with frightened families, animals, supplies, and tools, all packed tightly together in preparation for what might come next. The castle was not meant to be pleasant during a siege. It was meant to endure. But castles were more than shelters. They were symbols of authority. The sight of a fortress on the horizon sent a clear message: this land is claimed, defended, and controlled. For enemies, it was a warning. For allies, it was reassurance. For the lord who owned it, the castle was the physical embodiment of power. Without it, rule was fragile. With it, even a small force could dominate a region. Psychology played a crucial role in medieval warfare, and castles were designed to exploit it. Their towering walls, dark gatehouses, and massive doors were meant to intimidate long before battle began. An attacking army, upon seeing a well-fortified castle, had to make a difficult decision. Storming the walls meant heavy casualties. A siege meant months of waiting, disease, and dwindling supplies. Often, The mere presence of a strong castle was enough to deter an attack entirely. Inside the castle, life was shaped by the expectation of war. Lords and soldiers trained constantly, maintaining weapons and armor, repairing walls, and stockpiling supplies. Blacksmiths worked within the walls, forging arrowheads and reinforcing gates. Cooks preserved food through salting and drying, preparing for the day when no fresh supplies could enter. Wells were dug deep into bedrock to ensure access to water, even if the surrounding land was cut off. Every castle told a story of past conflicts. Scars from earlier sieges were repaired, but never forgotten. Builders learned from each attack, thickening walls, strengthening towers, and redesigning weak points. Castle architecture evolved as a response to human ingenuity in destruction. When attackers developed stronger battering rams, walls grew thicker. When siege towers appeared, moats became wider and deeper. It was an endless contest between offense and defense, innovation and countermeasure. The people who lived in and around castles understood their purpose intimately. For peasants, the castle was both protector and oppressor. It offered refuge during invasion, yet also symbolized feudal control and obligation. For soldiers, it was a workplace where discipline, vigilance, and endurance mattered more than glory. For nobles, it was a seat of power, a residence designed as much for command as for comfort. Contrary to popular imagination, medieval castles were rarely silent or serene. They echoed with the sounds of training drills, hammering stone, clanking armor, and shouted commands. Even in times of peace, the expectation of war never faded. Guards watched the horizon from towers day and night. Messengers arrived with news of shifting alliances and approaching threats. Readiness was not optional, it was survival. At the heart of castle defense lay a simple truth. Attackers needed to succeed once, but defenders only needed to succeed every time. One breached wall, one broken gate, one moment of carelessness could mean destruction. This reality shaped the mindset of medieval defense. Caution, redundancy, and overwhelming strength were valued above speed or elegance. Better to build walls too thick than too thin. Better to have multiple lines of defense than to trust a single barrier. The medieval battlefield extended beyond open fields and clashing armies. It lived in stone corridors, narrow staircases, and towering ramparts. War was fought vertically as much as horizontally. Height gave defenders control, turning gravity itself into a weapon. Stones dropped from walls could crush armor. Arrows fired downward gained deadly force. Attackers, exposed and exhausted, fought not just soldiers, but the environment itself. Castles also shaped the rhythm of medieval wars. Campaigns were planned around them. Armies moved from fortress to fortress, knowing that bypassing a stronghold was dangerous. An enemy castle left behind could cut supply lines, launch raids, or trap an army between fortified positions. As a result, wars became slow, grinding affairs, focused less on decisive battles and more on controlling key strongpoints. In this way, castles dictated strategy. They forced attackers to choose between costly assaults and drawn-out sieges. They bought time for defenders to call for reinforcements or negotiate alliances. They transformed war from a swift clash into a test of endurance, resources, and willpower. To truly understand medieval castles, one must see them not as isolated buildings, but as living systems embedded in a violent world. They were shaped by fear, necessity, and experience. They represented humanity's attempt to impose order on chaos, to create islands of control in a sea of uncertainty. When we look at medieval castles today, standing silent against the sky, it is easy to romanticize them. But in their time, they were places of tension and readiness, built for a world where peace was fragile and danger was always near. They were answers to a single, urgent question that defined an entire era. How do we survive when invasion is inevitable? And from that question, stone by stone, rose the medieval castle, the ultimate guardian of a brutal age. Long before the first stone was laid or the first wall rose into the sky, the fate of a medieval castle was decided by its location. In a world where warfare was constant and resources were limited, choosing the right place to build was as important as the strength of the walls themselves. A poorly positioned castle was a liability. A well-placed one could dominate an entire region with a relatively small garrison. Medieval builders understood this deeply, and they treated the landscape not as a backdrop, but as an active weapon. Elevation was the single most valuable advantage. Hills, cliffs, and rocky outcrops were prized above all else. From high ground, defenders could see approaching enemies hours or even days in advance. In an age without telescopes, radios, or maps, visibility meant survival. A castle perched on a hill did not need to guess when danger was coming. It could watch it unfold in real time. Columns of marching soldiers, clouds of dust raised by cavalry, or the glint of metal in the distance were all signs that defenders could prepare for long before the enemy arrived. Fighting uphill was a nightmare for medieval attackers. Armor was heavy, shields cumbersome, and weapons exhausting to carry over long distances. By the time an invading force reached the base of a hilltop castle, they were already tired, thirsty, and strained. Defenders, by contrast, were rested, supplied, and protected. Gravity itself favored them. Arrows fired downhill struck with greater force. Stones dropped from above became lethal missiles. Even simple actions, pushing ladders away or rolling logs down slopes, could cause devastating losses. Cliffs offered an even greater advantage. Castles built along sheer rock faces eliminated entire directions of attack. If one side of a fortress was protected by an unscalable cliff, defenders could concentrate their resources on the remaining approaches. Many famous castles appear almost fused to the landscape, their walls rising directly from rock, making it impossible to distinguish where nature ended and human construction began. This was not accidental. Medieval builders deliberately shaped castles to merge with their surroundings, turning geography into an extension of the fortress. Water was another crucial factor. Rivers, lakes, and coastlines shaped castle placement across Europe and beyond. A castle overlooking a river controlled trade routes, troop movements, and access to fresh water. Rivers acted as natural moats, slowing attackers and limiting where siege equipment could be deployed. Crossing water under enemy fire was extremely dangerous, and bridges became choke points that defenders could easily control or destroy. Some castles were built on islands or peninsulas, connected to the mainland by narrow causeways. These locations were nearly ideal from a defensive perspective. Attackers could only approach from limited directions, often single file, while defenders enjoyed clear lines of sight and fire. In times of danger, access routes could be flooded, blocked, or destroyed entirely, isolating the castle from attack. Swamps and marshlands also played a defensive role. Though unpleasant environments for daily life, they were deadly obstacles for invading armies. Mud swallowed horses, wagons, and siege engines. Disease spread rapidly in stagnant water, weakening besieging forces long before battle began. Castles near wetlands used these harsh conditions to their advantage, knowing that an enemy trapped in such terrain would suffer enormously. Forests, too, influenced castle placement. Dense woods restricted movement and visibility, making it difficult for large armies to maneuver or deploy effectively. While forests could conceal attackers, they also slowed them and made supply lines vulnerable. Castles built near forests often controlled the few clear paths through them, forcing invaders into predictable routes where ambushes and defensive preparations were possible. Beyond pure military considerations, castles were positioned to control people and resources. Feudal power depended on land, agriculture, and trade, and castles were placed where they could oversee all three. A castle overlooking fertile farmland ensured that peasants paid taxes and remained under control. One guarding a mountain pass regulated travel and commerce. Another, near a harbor, dominated maritime trade and protected ships. In this way, the castle became the anchor of a lord's authority. Its position was a constant reminder of who ruled the land. From its towers, banners could be seen for miles, signaling ownership and warning rivals to keep their distance. Even in peacetime, the castle's presence shaped behavior, discouraging rebellion and enforcing order through sheer visibility. Medieval builders also thought carefully about access to supplies. A castle, no matter how strong, was useless if it could not be sustained. Proximity to water was essential, not just rivers, but reliable springs and wells. Many castles were built where fresh water could be accessed deep underground, ensuring that even during long sieges, defenders would not die of thirst. Road networks influenced castle placement as well. Castles were often built near crossroads or along major routes, allowing defenders to monitor movement and respond quickly to threats. Control of roads meant control of armies, messengers, and merchants. A castle that dominated key routes could isolate enemies, gather intelligence, and project power far beyond its walls. The terrain around a castle was often deliberately shaped to enhance defense. Hillsides were cleared of trees to deny attackers cover. Slopes were steepened, ditches dug, and earth piled into embankments. The land itself was engineered to expose enemies and protect defenders. In some cases, entire villages were relocated or sacrificed to create clear fields of vision and fire around the fortress. Medieval warfare rewarded patience and planning, and castle placement reflected this mindset. Builders thought not only of immediate threats, but of future wars they could not yet imagine. They chose locations that could be defended with limited manpower, knowing that armies were expensive and difficult to maintain. A well-sited castle allowed a small garrison to hold off a much larger force simply by exploiting geography. This strategic thinking extended beyond individual castles. Networks of fortresses were designed to support one another, creating layered defenses across a region. Castles placed within signaling distance could warn each other of approaching enemies using fires, flags, or horns. An invader might capture one fortress, only to find themselves surrounded by others, each positioned to cut off retreat or reinforcements. The importance of location becomes even clearer when examining failed castles. Fortresses built on low ground, far from water, or too close to enemy territory were often abandoned or destroyed. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of castles that fell quickly because they were poorly positioned. Builders learned from these failures, passing knowledge down through generations. The people who lived within castles were constantly aware of the land around them. Guards memorized every hill, path, and river. Commanders planned defenses based on wind direction, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. Rain could turn roads into mud, slowing an enemy advance. Winter could freeze rivers, opening new routes of attack. The landscape was alive, changing, and always part of the defensive equation. Even the sun played a role. Some castles were oriented so that attackers approaching at certain times of day would be blinded by sunlight, while defenders remained in shadow. Such details may seem minor, but in medieval combat, small advantages often determined survival. Choosing a castle's location was therefore an act of foresight and experience. It required understanding warfare, geography, logistics, and human behavior. The land was read like a battlefield before the battle ever occurred. Every hill promised advantage or danger. Every river offered protection or risk. Nothing was left to chance. In the medieval mind, the landscape was not neutral. It was either friend or enemy. A castle built in harmony with its surroundings became far stronger than its walls alone suggested. It forced invaders to fight not just soldiers, but terrain, distance, fatigue, and fear. When an enemy army finally stood before such a castle, they were not simply confronting stone and steel. They were facing a position chosen with ruthless intelligence, a battlefield designed long before their arrival. And in that moment, many attackers realized a terrible truth. The battle had been lost before it ever began. This was the power of location in medieval castle defense. Long before arrows flew or gates were battered, the land itself had already chosen a side. As an invading army drew closer to a medieval castle, the true test of endurance and courage began. Long before attackers could strike a gate or scale a wall, they were forced to confront the outer defenses, features designed not merely to slow them down, but to exhaust, terrify, and break their will. These defenses transformed open ground into a killing zone, where every step forward carried risk and every pause invited death. Moats, ditches, earthworks, and towering stone walls worked together as a single system, turning the approach to a castle into one of the most dangerous journeys in medieval warfare. The moat was often the first obstacle an attacker faced, and its psychological impact was as powerful as its physical danger. Popular imagination pictures moats as clean, water-filled trenches surrounding elegant castles, but reality was far harsher. Many moats were stagnant, foul-smelling pits filled with mud, waste, animal remains, and disease. Falling into one meant not only the risk of drowning, but infection, injury, and helpless exposure to enemy fire. Even dry moats posed a serious threat. Deep, wide, and steep-sided, they trapped attackers below the level of the walls, placing them in the perfect position for archers and stone throwers above. Crossing a moat under fire was chaos. Soldiers carrying ladders, shields, and weapons struggled to maintain formation while arrows rained down from above. Temporary bridges could be destroyed in moments. Siege towers became stuck in mud or were toppled by defenders. Men slipped, fell, and were crushed by those behind them. What looked like a simple trench from a distance became a nightmare of confusion and death up close. Beyond the moat rose the walls themselves, immense barriers of stone that defined the medieval castle. These walls were not built thin or delicate. They were massive, often several meters thick, designed to absorb punishment from siege engines and remain standing. Stones were carefully cut and fitted, bound together with mortar, and reinforced over generations as builders learned from past attacks. In some castles, walls grew thicker at the base and thinner toward the top, increasing stability while conserving materials. Height was as important as thickness. Tall walls forced attackers to rely on ladders, siege towers, or grappling hooks, all of which were difficult to use under fire. The higher the wall, the longer attackers were exposed while climbing. A single broken rung, a slipping hand, or a well-placed strike from above could send a man falling to his death. Even those who reached the top were often exhausted, disoriented, and immediately confronted by armed defenders waiting behind battlements. Many castle walls were built with sloped bases, known as battering slopes or talus. These angled foundations served several purposes. They made it harder to undermine the wall by digging tunnels as the slope caused excavations to collapse. They also deflected projectiles, reducing the effectiveness of stones hurled by catapults. Most importantly, they turned gravity into a weapon. Anything dropped from the top, rocks, logs, burning materials, bounced outward, striking attackers clustered at the base. The surface of castle walls was deliberately hostile. Handholds were minimized, and smooth stone made climbing difficult even without enemy interference. Defenders could push ladders away with poles, cut ropes, or tip siege equipment over the edge. Boiling water, hot sand, and sometimes burning pitch were poured down, not always to kill, but to blind, burn, and sow panic. Sand was especially feared, as it slipped into armor and eyes, causing unbearable pain. Castle walls were rarely straight lines. They were designed with angles, curves, and projections that eliminated blind spots and allowed defenders to cover every approach with overlapping fire. Attackers who hugged the wall for protection quickly discovered that there was nowhere safe to stand. From towers and parapets, defenders could strike from multiple directions, turning the wall into a continuous threat. The top of the wall was protected by battlements, alternating raised sections and gaps. From behind these crenellations, defenders could fire arrows and crossbow bolts while remaining shielded. This simple design allowed constant pressure on attackers with minimal risk to those inside. Even inexperienced soldiers could contribute to defense, firing from relative safety while more skilled warriors prepared for close combat. Time worked relentlessly against attackers at the walls. Siege warfare was physically and mentally exhausting. Standing under constant fire, carrying heavy equipment, and watching comrades fall took a severe toll on morale. Each failed attempt made the walls seem taller, stronger, and more invincible. Defenders, by contrast, fought on familiar ground, protected by stone and confident in their advantage. Weather amplified these defenses. Rain turned the ground near walls into mud, making movement slow and dangerous. Wind could blow smoke and burning materials back onto attackers. In winter, ice made ladders slippery, and numb fingers reduced grip strength. Castle builders understood these effects and relied on them, knowing that nature often fought on their side. The walls also served as platforms for a variety of defensive weapons. Archers and crossbowmen were the most common, trained to fire downward into dense groups of attackers. Crossbows, in particular, were devastating, capable of penetrating armor at short range. Some castles used stone, throwing devices mounted on walls to hurl heavy objects down onto besiegers, turning the structure itself into a weapon. The sheer scale of castle walls communicated a message of futility. An attacking army might spend days or weeks probing defenses, only to realize that progress was minimal and losses were mounting. Every stone seemed to promise resistance. Every tower suggested more defenders waiting above. This psychological pressure was often decisive. Commanders had to ask whether the prize was worth the cost. Defenders were not passive behind these walls. They repaired damage constantly, filling cracks, reinforcing weak points, and rebuilding sections damaged by siege engines. Nighttime raids were launched from hidden posterns, small, concealed doors in the walls, allowing defenders to burn siege equipment or harass attackers before retreating back into safety. These sudden strikes kept besiegers on edge, unable to rest or feel secure. The relationship between moat and wall was crucial. The moat prevented siege engines from reaching the wall easily, while the wall ensured that anyone trapped in the moat was vulnerable. Together, they created a layered defense that punished attackers at every stage. Even if a section of wall was breached, rubble often formed a secondary barrier, forcing attackers to climb again under fire. Over time, castles evolved in response to new threats. When attackers developed more powerful siege weapons, walls grew thicker and were reinforced with additional layers. Some castles added outer walls, creating concentric defenses that required attackers to overcome multiple barriers in sequence. Each success brought them into another killing zone, repeating the cycle of exhaustion and loss. For the people inside the castle, these walls were more than stone. They were shields against chaos. During an attack, families huddled in inner courtyards while soldiers took their positions above. The sound of arrows striking stone, the shouts of defenders, and the cries of the wounded echoed constantly. Yet the walls held as they were meant to do. In medieval warfare, victory was rarely swift. It was earned through persistence, suffering, and endurance. Castle walls embodied this reality. They were built to resist not just physical force, but time itself. Every hour an attacker spent at the walls drained supplies, weakened resolve, and increased the risk of failure. When historians speak of castles as symbols of power, it is these walls they often mean. They represented the ability to say no, to deny access, to resist conquest, and to force enemies to pay dearly for every advance. Standing before them, attackers were reminded that some obstacles could not be overcome by courage alone. Thus, the approach to a medieval castle was not a single battle, but a prolonged ordeal. Moats and walls worked together to grind down even the strongest armies. Long before a gate was touched or a tower threatened, many invasions had already failed here, at the foot of stone defenses that seemed to rise endlessly into the sky. In this unforgiving space between open field and inner stronghold, the medieval castle proved its true purpose. It turned land into a trap, stone into a weapon, and patience into power. And for countless invaders throughout history, it was here, before the moat, beneath the walls, that ambition died. As attackers pressed closer to the heart of a medieval castle, surviving moats and towering walls, they entered the most lethal zone of all. This was the space where defense became intimate, brutal, and almost impossible to escape. Here, castles revealed their darkest genius, not through sheer size, but through precision, traps, and controlled violence. Arrow slits, murder holes, narrow passages, and gatehouses were designed to turn courage into panic and momentum into massacre. For invaders, reaching this stage did not mean success. It meant they had stepped into a carefully engineered death trap. Arrow slits, also known as loopholes, appear deceptively simple from the outside. Thin, vertical openings cut into stone walls, barely wide enough for a hand or weapon. Yet these narrow gaps represented one of the most effective defensive innovations of medieval warfare. From inside the castle, archers enjoyed protection while maintaining a wide field of fire. The design allowed defenders to aim left, right, up, and down, tracking moving targets with deadly accuracy. From the outside, attackers often could not even see who was shooting at them. Archery was central to castle defense. Longbows and crossbows could be fired repeatedly from behind arrow slits, raining death onto exposed attackers. The psychological effect was devastating. Men advanced knowing arrows could strike at any moment, from unseen enemies, from walls that seemed alive with hostile eyes. Shields offered limited protection, and armor, while helpful, was far from invincible. A well-placed bolt could penetrate chainmail, pierce gaps in plate armor, or cripple limbs, turning soldiers into burdens for their comrades. Crossbows were especially feared. Though slower to reload than longbows, they required less training and delivered immense stopping power. Fired from close range through arrow slits, crossbow bolts could punch through shields and armor alike. The sound alone, a sharp, heavy snap, was enough to freeze attackers in place. Castle defenders used this fear deliberately, maintaining constant fire to deny attackers any sense of safety. As attackers moved closer, the environment itself turned against them. Narrow walkways and tight angles forced soldiers into cramped formations. There was no room to maneuver, no space to retreat quickly, and no way to bring overwhelming numbers to bear. Medieval castles were designed to negate the advantage of large armies. 10 defenders in the right position could hold off hundreds simply by controlling space. The gatehouse was the focal point of this defensive philosophy. From the outside, it appeared to be the obvious target, a large opening in an otherwise impenetrable wall. To attackers, it promised entry, progress, and victory. In reality, it was the most fortified and deadly structure in the entire castle. Castle gates were not single doors, but complex systems layered with obstacles. Heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands resisted fire and battering rams. Behind them often hung one or more portcullises, massive iron or wooden grills that could be dropped suddenly from above. These could crush men, trap siege equipment, or split attacking forces into helpless fragments. Between these barriers lay narrow tunnels, sometimes twisting, sometimes straight, always lethal. These passageways were intentionally cramped, forcing attackers to bunch together. Above them were murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which defenders could attack from complete safety. Boiling water, hot sand, stones, and sometimes burning substances were poured down onto trapped invaders. Hot sand was particularly cruel, slipping into armor and clothing, burning skin and blinding eyes. Water, though not always boiling, caused panic and disorientation, especially when mixed with debris and filth. The gatehouse was designed to kill without mercy. Attackers trapped inside had nowhere to run. Those behind pushed forward, unaware of the carnage ahead. Those in front were crushed, burned, or stabbed from above and the sides. Even if attackers managed to break through the outer door, they often found themselves sealed inside a stone corridor with no escape. Side doors and hidden openings allowed defenders to strike unexpectedly. Soldiers could thrust spears through concealed gaps, stab legs and torsos, then withdraw before attackers could respond. In some castles, the floors of gate passages were uneven or sloped, increasing the chance of slips and falls under pressure. Panic spread quickly in such confined spaces, turning disciplined troops into a screaming mass of bodies. Staircases within castles followed the same ruthless logic. Spiral stairs were usually built to turn clockwise as one ascended. This favored right-handed defenders descending the stairs, who had full freedom to swing swords and axes. Attackers climbing upward were constrained by the central column, their weapon arms pinned and movements restricted. A single defender positioned correctly could hold a staircase against multiple attackers, striking downward with devastating force. Light and darkness were also weapons. Interiors near gates and corridors were often dim, forcing attackers to move blindly, while defenders, familiar with the space, struck with confidence. Smoke from fires or burning materials further reduced visibility, choking attackers and amplifying fear. The sounds of battle, metal striking stone, screams echoing through tunnels, created an overwhelming sensory assault. The cumulative effect of these defenses was psychological collapse. Attackers who had survived arrows, walls, and moats now faced invisible enemies attacking from every direction. They could not see their opponents clearly. They could not maneuver. They could not retreat easily. Every instinct screamed that the castle itself was trying to kill them. Defenders understood this deeply. They were trained not just to fight, but to intimidate. Shouting, horns, drums, and sudden counterattacks were used to shatter enemy morale. Sometimes defenders deliberately waited until attackers were deep inside the gatehouse before dropping portcullises, sealing their fate. Few moments in medieval warfare were as terrifying as hearing iron crash down behind you, knowing escape was impossible. Even when attackers succeeded in breaching a gatehouse, victory was far from assured. Many castles were designed with secondary barriers just beyond the gate, inner walls, additional courtyards, or another fortified door. Each layer repeated the process, forcing attackers to fight again under fire, again in narrow spaces, again against prepared defenders. Castle defense was as much about discipline as brutality. Defenders rotated positions to avoid exhaustion. Ammunition was stored strategically along walls and towers. Commanders coordinated fire, focusing on siege equipment operators, officers, and standard bearers to disrupt enemy command and control. The goal was not just to repel attackers, but to break their ability to function as an army. For the attackers, every minute spent in this environment drained strength and resolve. Casualties mounted quickly, wounded men blocked passages, blood made stone floors slippery, shouts turned into screams, then into silence. Even the bravest soldiers began to question whether any objective was worth this cost. History records countless assaults that failed at the gatehouse alone. Armies that had marched for months, spent fortunes, and endured disease and hunger were stopped by stone corridors and hidden holes in ceilings. Commanders learned, often too late, that castles were not meant to be rushed. They were meant to be endured or avoided entirely. For those inside the castle, these defenses were grim necessities. They knew what awaited them if the walls fell: slaughter, enslavement, or worse. Mercy was rare in medieval warfare. Defense was absolute because the consequences of failure were absolute. Every arrow fired, every stone dropped, every trap sprung was an act of survival. In this close, claustrophobic world of stone and shadow, medieval castles revealed their true nature. They were not passive fortifications. They were active instruments of destruction, designed to control space, manipulate fear, and turn human aggression back upon itself. By the time attackers reached the inner defenses, many had already lost the battle in their minds. Courage had been ground down by design, by repetition, by terror, and often, before the final blow was ever struck, the assault collapsed, not because the attackers lacked strength, but because the castle had done exactly what it was built to do. It had broken them. As assaults failed and direct attacks bled armies dry, medieval warfare shifted into a slower, colder phase. When walls could not be scaled and gates could not be broken, invaders turned to endurance. This was the age of towers, sieges, and fear, where victory depended not on a single battle, but on patience, resources, and psychological collapse. Castles were designed for this phase of war as deliberately as they were for open assault, and in many cases they proved even more powerful when the fighting stopped and the waiting began. Towers were among the most critical elements of castle defense during prolonged conflict. Rising above walls, they served as eyes, weapons, and symbols of dominance. From their heights, defenders could observe enemy camps, track movements, and anticipate attacks. Nothing happened beyond the walls without being seen. Fires lit at night, shifts in troop positions, the construction of siege engines, all were visible from above. Information was power, and towers ensured defenders were never blind. Over time, castle design shifted from square towers to round ones, a change driven by hard experience. Square towers had weak corners that could be undermined or shattered by repeated attacks. Round towers, by contrast, deflected projectiles more effectively and offered no obvious weak points. Stones hurled by catapults glanced off curved surfaces instead of striking flat walls. Undermining became far more difficult. These towers were not just architectural choices. They were lessons learned through blood. From towers, defenders controlled the battlefield. Archers and crossbowmen fired in all directions, eliminating blind spots and overlapping fields of fire. Attackers could not approach one section of wall without exposing themselves to fire from multiple towers. This constant pressure made even basic tasks, like digging trenches or assembling siege equipment, dangerous and exhausting. Yet towers were only part of the equation. When direct assaults failed, attackers attempted to starve castles into surrender through siege. A siege was not a battle of swords, but of time. The goal was to cut off supplies, isolate the castle, and wait for hunger, thirst, or despair to force capitulation. In theory, this was safer than storming the walls. In practice, it was often just as deadly. Castles were built with sieges in mind. Their designers assumed that relief might not come for months, sometimes years. As a result, food storage was a priority. Granaries were stocked with grain, salted meat, dried legumes, and preserved fruits. Cellars were cool and dark, designed to extend the life of supplies. Livestock chickens, pigs, goats were often brought inside the walls at the first sign of danger, providing fresh food for as long as possible. Water was even more critical. A castle without water was already lost. Many fortresses were built around natural springs or had deep wells dug into bedrock. Some wells reached astonishing depths, carved by hand over decades. These ensured that even if attackers poisoned surrounding rivers or cut off access, defenders could still survive. In some castles, secret tunnels led to hidden water sources outside the walls, known only to a few trusted individuals. Sieges tested not only logistics, but discipline. Rations were carefully controlled. Waste was managed to prevent disease. The sick were isolated as much as possible. Morale was maintained through routine, prayer, and constant reminders that the walls still stood. The goal was to make life inside the castle harsh, but stable, predictable enough to endure. For attackers, siege life was often worse. An army camped outside a castle faced exposure to weather, disease, and supply shortages. Armies required enormous amounts of food and fodder, and the surrounding countryside was quickly stripped bare. As weeks passed, hunger spread through the besieging force. Sanitation was poor, and outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and plague were common. Ironically, the attackers often suffered more than those they tried to starve. Defenders used this to their advantage. They launched psychological warfare designed to break enemy morale. Bodies of fallen attackers were sometimes displayed on walls as warnings. Loud noises, horns, drums, shouting, were used at night to deny besiegers rest. Occasional sorties, sudden attacks launched from hidden gates, destroyed siege equipment and killed guards, reminding attackers that the castle was still dangerous. Fear was a weapon as sharp as any blade. The sight of towers looming above an army day after day created a sense of futility. No matter how long the siege lasted, the walls remained, flags still flew. Bells still rang. This constancy eroded confidence. Soldiers began to doubt their commanders. Rumors spread. Desertion increased. Castles were also designed to communicate strength beyond their walls. Signal fires, flags, and messengers allowed defenders to call for aid. Nearby fortresses could be alerted, allies summoned, and relief armies assembled. Attackers knew that every day spent at a siege increased the chance of being trapped between the castle and an approaching force. Many sieges were abandoned not because the castle fell, but because the besiegers feared becoming besieged themselves. The psychological burden of siege warfare was immense. For those inside the castle, uncertainty was constant. Supplies dwindled slowly. Every meal reminded them of the clock ticking down. For attackers, the waiting was often unbearable. Men joined armies expecting glory and battle, not months of mud, hunger, and disease. Morale collapsed quietly, not in dramatic moments, but in exhaustion and despair. Towers amplified this psychological pressure. They were constant reminders of control. From their heights, defenders could observe suffering in the enemy camp, sick soldiers, shortages, arguments. The knowledge that the enemy could see them while remaining unreachable deepened frustration and humiliation. Even negotiations during sieges favored defenders. From the safety of towers and walls, lords could speak to enemy commanders as equals or superiors. They could delay talks, demand better terms, or simply refuse to negotiate at all. Time was on their side. The castle existed to wait. History shows that many sieges ended without a final assault. Armies withdrew due to lack of supplies, internal conflict, or external threats. The castle, unchanged, emerged victorious simply by enduring. In this sense, endurance was the ultimate weapon of medieval defense. Yet not all sieges ended cleanly. When supplies finally ran out inside a castle, desperation set in. Rations were reduced to near starvation, horses were slaughtered, pets disappeared. In extreme cases, chronicles speak of cannibalism. These moments were rare but terrifying, reminders that even the strongest defenses had limits. Attackers understood this and sometimes used cruelty to accelerate collapse. They cut down nearby orchards, poisoned fields, and executed captives within sight of the walls. These acts were meant to break morale, to convince defenders that resistance was pointless. But castles were designed to resist not just hunger, but despair. As long as walls stood and water flowed, hope survived. The tower remained the heart of this resistance. From it, commanders ruled, priests prayed, and defenders watched. It symbolized defiance. To attackers, it was an insult, a structure that refused to yield, that watched them suffer in silence. Siege warfare revealed the true philosophy behind medieval castles. They were not built to win battles quickly. They were built to make victory unbearably expensive for the enemy. Every day of resistance drained resources, weakened resolve, and increased risk. The castle did not need to defeat the army outside. It only needed to survive it. In the end, towers, sieges, and psychological warfare worked together as a single system. Stone controlled space, time controlled outcomes, fear controlled minds. Medieval castles mastered all three. For countless invaders across centuries, the realization came slowly and painfully. The castle was not their enemy. Time was, and time, more often than not, belonged to those behind the walls. As the centuries passed, the medieval castle, once the unassailable heart of feudal power, began to confront new challenges that would ultimately redefine its role in warfare and society. For hundreds of years, these fortresses had dominated the battlefield, shaped the landscape, and dictated the strategies of armies. They had resisted swords, arrows, catapults, and siege engines, leveraging height, stone, and psychological terror to secure victory. But the world was changing. New technologies, new tactics, and the relentless march of human ingenuity would slowly erode the supremacy of stone walls, transforming castles from military powerhouses into symbols of authority, prestige, and cultural identity. Understanding this transformation is crucial to appreciating the full story of medieval fortifications, their purpose, and their enduring legacy. The most decisive factor in the decline of castle dominance was the advent of gunpowder and artillery. Cannons, which emerged in Europe in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, fundamentally changed the calculus of siege warfare. A wall that once withstood years of attacks from trebuchets and battering rams could now be shattered in hours by heavy cannon fire. Early gunpowder weapons were cumbersome, slow to load, and prone to misfires, but their destructive potential was undeniable. Castles that had been thought impregnable were suddenly vulnerable, and the tactics of both attackers and defenders had to evolve rapidly. The impact of artillery on castle architecture was profound. Builders experimented with lower, thicker walls, angled bastions, and earthen ramparts designed to absorb cannon shots rather than resist them. Vertical walls, which had once been the defining feature of medieval fortifications, became liabilities as they were easy targets for cannonballs. Castles began to adopt designs that we now associate with early modern fortifications: star-shaped layouts, angular bastions, and extensive outworks intended to deflect fire and provide overlapping fields of defense. These new designs were expensive and complex, requiring not only skilled labor but also knowledge of geometry, physics, and ballistics. The old medieval castle, with its towering stone walls and round or square towers, could no longer compete. Even as gunpowder changed military engineering, the political landscape of Europe was also evolving. Centralized monarchies were emerging, consolidating power over regions that had once been governed by independent or semi-independent lords. With larger armies, better communication, and more organized logistics, kings could project power over wide territories, reducing the necessity for isolated castles as autonomous centers of defense. Castles remained useful as administrative centers, prisons, and symbols of authority, but their primary function as military strongholds diminished. Economic factors accelerated this transformation. Maintaining a castle was expensive, requiring constant labor to repair walls, maintain gates, tend to wells, and stock food for potential sieges. As warfare technology advanced, the cost of updating older castles to withstand artillery became prohibitive. Many castles were abandoned, left to decay, or repurposed for non-military uses. Some were converted into palaces or estates, blending fortification with comfort, reflecting the new priorities of ruling elites: prestige, domesticity, and display of power rather than pure defense. Despite these changes, the symbolism of castles remained potent. Even as their military relevance waned, castles continued to represent authority, wealth, and control. Their towering walls, imposing gates, and elevated positions conveyed a message of power to both subjects and rivals. In many regions, castles were transformed into administrative hubs, overseeing taxation, trade, and justice. They became centers of social life, hosting courts, banquets, and ceremonies. The castle's architecture evolved to reflect these dual roles, combining defensive features with residential and ceremonial spaces. The cultural and psychological impact of castles extended far beyond their immediate surroundings. For centuries, they had dominated the imagination of contemporaries, shaping stories, legends, and perceptions of power. Knights, lords, and rulers were defined by the castles they commanded. Siege engines, battlements, and towers were not only practical, they were symbols of dominance and deterrence. Even when cannon fire rendered the walls less effective militarily, the aura of authority surrounding a castle remained intact. To attack a castle was still to challenge the social and political order it represented, a challenge that carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. At the same time, the people who lived in castles experienced dramatic changes. The harsh, militarized life of constant vigilance gave way to more comfortable, organized living conditions. Advances in domestic architecture allowed for larger windows, more elaborate halls, and better sanitation. Kitchens, chapels, and living quarters became more sophisticated, reflecting the shift from purely military function to domestic and administrative use. Castles were no longer just defensive machines. They became homes, symbols of prestige, and centers of governance. The transition from medieval to early modern castles illustrates the broader evolution of society. Warfare became increasingly complex, centralized, and technological, requiring adaptation at every level of strategy and engineering. Castles, once the pinnacle of military innovation, had to reinvent themselves or face obsolescence. Their decline as defensive structures was not a failure of design, but a reflection of the relentless pace of change in human society. They had served their purpose for centuries, shaping the conduct of war, the development of technology, and the structure of medieval life. Interestingly, while the military function of castles diminished, their influence on architecture persisted. Fortified homes, urban bastions, and even city walls drew inspiration from medieval castles. Elements such as towers, battlements, and gatehouses continued to be used for their symbolic value, even when actual defense was no longer necessary. The aesthetic and psychological power of these features endured long after their practical use had passed, demonstrating the enduring legacy of medieval engineering and design. Castles also played a role in the recording of history and the preservation of culture. Many became repositories for art, literature, and historical records. Libraries, chapels, and halls within castles preserved knowledge and facilitated the transmission of culture across generations. They were not merely passive structures. They were centers of social memory, embodying the ideals, fears, and ambitions of the people who built and inhabited them. The stories of sieges, heroic defenses, and political intrigue that unfolded within their walls were recorded and retold, ensuring that castles remained central to the historical imagination. For the modern observer, castles are often romanticized as relics of a bygone era. Stories of valiant knights, heroic sieges, and dramatic battles dominate popular imagination, yet the reality was harsher and more complex. Castles were the product of necessity, experience, and human ingenuity. They combined architecture, engineering, psychology, and strategy in ways that reflected the realities of medieval life. They were built to endure, to dominate, and to control, not for aesthetics, comfort, or decoration. Even as they became obsolete militarily, their presence continued to shape social, political, and cultural structures. The decline of castles as military fortresses did not erase their influence. They left an indelible mark on urban planning, military theory, and architecture. The study of castles informs our understanding of logistics, defense strategy, and the interplay between technology and social organization. By examining the ways in which castles were constructed, fortified, and defended, historians gain insight into the priorities, fears, and ambitions of medieval society. Castles were both products and shapers of their time, reflecting the interplay between environment, technology, and human behavior. In conclusion, the story of the medieval castle is one of adaptation, endurance, and transformation. For centuries, castles were unmatched fortresses, dominating landscapes and armies alike. Their walls, towers, gates, and defensive innovations shaped the conduct of warfare, influenced social structures, and dictated the flow of history. Yet as gunpowder and artillery emerged, centralized states grew stronger, and warfare evolved. Castles gradually lost their role as purely military instruments. They became symbols of authority, centers of administration, and homes of the elite. Even in decline, they retained psychological, cultural, and architectural significance. The medieval castle, in all its complexity, was never merely stone. It was a reflection of human ingenuity, resilience, and the enduring struggle for survival in a world defined by conflict and ambition. Today, standing in quiet ruin or restored glory, castles continue to tell the story of a time when survival depended on walls, vigilance, and the relentless will to endure, reminding us that even as technology and tactics change, the human desire to protect, control, and symbolize power remains constant.